I'm delighted to be here, and I echo Jane's comments about what a wonderful time I've had, and such good eats, eh? So appropriate, so it's been really, really great. This last session this afternoon is on Foodways, Pathways to Exploring Cultural Identities. And I think it was Wendy, in one of her remarks earlier in her presentation, who made a remark about how food always, it seems, comes with deep cultural meanings. And that's really what this panel sets out to explore, the cultural meanings and the foodways, and food as a pathway to explore cultural identities. We have three presenters this afternoon. I'm going to introduce all of them now, and then just let them go ahead and present. And we'll just do this in the order that they appear in your program. So our first presenter this afternoon is Alison Norman. You want to give a wave, Alison? Dr. Alison Norman. Alison defended her thesis in 2010, and she is currently a SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at Trent University. This afternoon she'll be presenting a paper called Our Strength Comes from the Land, the Hybrid Culinary Traditions of the Six Nations of Grand River. The second presenter this afternoon is Emily Weiskopf-Ball, and Emily is a student of mine actually at Laurentian. She's a PhD candidate in the interdisciplinary PhD program in Human Studies at Laurentian. Her talk this afternoon is called Traditional Food in Ontario's North, an Autoethnographic study of a family's evolving traditional food practices. And our third presenter is Dr. Yes, I can still say this, it's very fresh, Dr. Nadia Jones-Gailani. She just defended her PhD thesis under the supervision of Franca Iacovetta. She defended in January. And Nadia this afternoon will be presenting on coffee culture, negotiating space and identity in interviews with transnational Iraqi refugee women. So three wonderful papers in store. And Alison, I'll let you go first.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so this paper comes partly out of my dissertation research, and it's an article that I'm revising for Cuisine. Natalie put this somewhere, and I owe it. It's being revised, and it's coming soon. So I'm looking forward to any feedback. So at a banquet held in February 1924 by the OWHN Women's Institute, the Six Nations women members provided the catering, and the menu was as follows: cold ham, salads, jellies, bread and butter, cheese, pickles, celery, ice cream, and cake and coffee. They charged 50 cents a person. While the women had discussed renting plates from Brantford, they ended up deciding that it was too expensive to do so, and so they borrowed everyone's plates from the village. This menu is very different from sort of the traditional sorts of foods that the Six Nations had been eating for centuries. For instance, in the past, a Six Nations menu might have consisted of corn soup, cornbread, wild rice, roasted venison or moose, squash, baked apples, strawberry juice to drink. So clearly there's a change that's taken place. And the focus of this paper is the evolution of culinary traditions among the Six Nations, or the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people in southern Ontario into the mid-20th century. And while I describe how there was an exchange of culinary customs between British settlers and First Nations people in the 19th century in the chapter that I wrote in Edible Histories, by this period, when it came to cooking, the balance really had tipped in favor of the dominant culture. While some traditional foods were still prepared, especially by traditionalists or longhouse people, many of the Christian women on the reserve were preparing a cuisine that was quite similar to their non-native Brant County neighbors by the 1920s and 30s. And in particular, my research looks at how two organizations, the Women's Institutes and the Six Nations Agricultural Society, were at the forefront of encouraging an Anglo-Canadian diet among the community. The culinary changes reflect, in many ways, the success of government efforts to assimilate the community and make them a Christian and agrarian people. And it also represents either a dilution or a loss of traditional culture, heritage, and identity. And in some ways, it represents the creation of a new Anglo-Native identity on the reserve. So a little bit of background. The Six Nations of Grand River is a small reserve located southeast of the city of Brantford, Ontario. The inhabitants, of course, originally came from upstate New York, where they were farmers, fishers, hunters, gatherers. Maize or Indian corn was the central crop of the Iroquois, and it played a critical role in Iroquois culture and history. Corn was cultivated on a large scale, and this necessitated permanent settlement, resulting in heavily fortified villages and the construction of longhouses where intergenerational families lived. And as many of you probably know, Iroquois society, within it there was a gender division of labor, in which men were responsible for hunting and warring, women took care of the crops and the gardens and horticulture within the community. And throughout the 19th century, as the need for waging war decreased, men had more time to participate in field labor, although it was still primarily the women's domain, with clan matrons responsible for ordering the planting, cultivation, and harvesting. Corn was grown with beans and squash, or pumpkin, in a tradition many of you probably have heard of called the Three Sisters. Land and labor were saved by this method, and the plants benefited from each other. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb. The beans provided nitrogen that then enriched the soil in which the squash and corn were planted. And the squash would spread out over the ground, preventing weeds, and creating a microclimate to retain moisture in the soil. But the Iroquois also believed that these three vegetables were guarded by three inseparable sister spirits, and that the plants would not thrive if planted separately. Corn, as I said, was a very important crop, and it was eaten in many different ways. One common method was to pound the corn into meal or flour, and to bake it into bread or cakes. Iroquois women and their children often also gathered wild roots, berries, nuts, and herbs, and developed methods of making maple sugar out of sap. Men fished using nets in the winter and went ice fishing in the winter. Nets in the summer and ice fishing in the winter, and hunted deer, wild turkey, muskrat, beaver, etc. A number of these traditions began to change once the Iroquois began to convert to Christianity and learn new farming methods. They migrated to Ontario after the American Revolution in 1784, or several thousand of them did. And they were granted tracts of land in return for their loyalty to the crown. So several thousand people from the Six Nations in upstate New York traveled and settled along the Grand River, as well as at Tyendinaga near Deseronto in eastern Ontario. They brought with them their culinary customs, including the Three Sisters method of planting corn, bean, and squash. A large number of these Six Nations people were already converts to Christianity after centuries of contact with Anglo-American missionaries in the United States. And many were also successful farmers whose methods resembled their non-native American neighbors. They grew corn, oats, wheat, and barley, and kept cattle. Subsistence gardening was more common amongst the traditional longhouse families than amongst the Christian farmers. So the Iroquois in Ontario had retained some of their culinary customs, but they had also adopted new farming practices, which led to changes in their diets. In the 19th century, missionaries and British colonial officials, and later the Canadian government, attempted to civilize, in quotation marks, and assimilate the First Nations, and part of that involved changing their eating habits, of course. As food reflects the community's culture, the First Nations needed to adopt Anglo-Canadian culinary customs to become assimilated. In the 19th century, as one historian explains, quote, progress and the Protestant work ethic became the driving force behind many of the changes and attempted innovations at Grand River, end quote. Agriculture and education were the two means by which the Six Nations were to be, quote, civilized, and they were successful at both. The Grand River Reserve became the showpiece for the Indian Department because they were seen as a successful example of Aboriginal adjustment to Canadian society. The Christian farmers were the majority of the population, and they worked hard to improve their community. Several popular voluntary organizations were formed in the mid to late 19th century, whose goals were community improvement. In 1867, the Six Nations Agricultural Society was formed by several wealthy Mohawk farmers. In 1883, they held their first annual fall exhibition, which continues to this day. So the Agricultural Society is the first Aboriginal agricultural society in Canada. And the activities of this group were similar to other agricultural societies in rural communities in Ontario. They held competitions at the annual fall fair, and the competitions were only open, of course, to people from Six Nations, although other people from Brantford were welcome to come as visitors and spectators. And the competitions in agriculture and food seem to be some of the most important competitions at the fair. In the 1870s, women competed in categories that reflected both traditional Iroquois skills, such as making cornbread, maple sugar, and beadwork, as well as newer traditions, such as making white bread, woolen socks, and machine sewing. Poet and performer Pauline Johnson commented on Six Nations women's abilities in 1900, as evidenced at the Agricultural Society exhibitions. She said, "The Iroquois woman of today has already acquired the arts of cookery, of needlework, of housewifeliness, and one has but to attend the annual industrial exhibition on the Indian Reserve, an institution that is open to all Indians in Canada who desire to compete for prizes, to convince themselves by very material arguments that the Iroquois woman is behind her white sister in nothing pertaining to the larder, the dairy, or the linen press. She bakes the loveliest, lightest wheaten bread, of which, by the way, her menfolk complain loudly, declaring that she forces them to eat this newfangled food to the absolute exclusion of their time-honored cornbread, to which the national palate ever clings. Her rolls of yellow butter are faultlessly sweet and firm. Her sealed fruits are a pleasure to see as well as taste. In fact, in this latter industry, she excels herself, outdoing frequently her white competitors at the neighboring city of Brantford, where the Southern Fair of Ontario is held annually." Clearly, Six Nations farm women were experts at the skills on display at the exhibition. Men did compete as well. Aside from prizes for the best horses, cattle, fruits, and vegetables, men also competed for the best axe handle and the best dressed deer skin. So it was not just Western farming skills that were being displayed at the annual fair, but some traditional Haudenosaunee or Iroquois skills as well. And this suggests a move towards an Anglo-Canadian identity at Six Nations, but certainly not complete assimilation. So the Women's Institutes are the other group I want to talk about a little bit. They were founded in 1912, but due to World War I, they sort of folded and really restarted again and became popular in the 1920s. There were 3 branches established. And the goal of the organization was to improve the lives of farm women, to educate them about running more efficient and healthy homes. And of course, cooking was part of this. So these women's institutes often catered the dinners of the Ploughmen's Association and the Farmers' Institutes. They sold tickets for the meals, and the members of the organizations would get a discounted price. The women always cooked for both their own events, and then they catered the men's events as well. And generally, there are, I've done a lot of sort of family history research, and their husbands are generally in the farmers, and they're in the women's institutes. A lot of connections. Many of these sorts of events were very similar to what other non-native farming communities were eating. Things like roast chicken and beef are often discussed, for instance. And I think that the menus like the one I listed at the beginning of the paper reflect the Anglo-Canadian middle-class norms that many people at Six Nations aspire to. They talked about food a lot at monthly meetings. Occasionally they had a speaker come talk on a culinary topic. For instance, in 1926, a Women's Institute member from Toronto came to the reserve to give a course on food values and cooking. The Institute also realized the comfort and pleasure that food provided and used some of their funds to provide snacks for the school children on the reserve, including ice cream and lemonade in the summer and hot cocoa in the winter. And this was both at the residential school, the Mohawk Institute, and the 10 or so day schools on the reserve. And so while most of the foods the Women's Institute cooked were Anglo-Canadian type foods, they did continue to make corn soup for many of the dinners and fairs that they catered. So the Women's Institutes and Agricultural Society were key institutions in the community, and the women that were involved in running them constituted a social elite in many ways. They were from families who dominated the elected council, the churches, the social societies, and voluntary groups. And in my dissertation, I've looked at how they used their power to affect change on the reserve in a variety of ways. They wrote protests or acted both in their own part and for people in the community. Initiatives for improvement on the reserve came from the Christian Six Nations generally. Things like bolstering the morality of school children, building sidewalks in Ohwchen. They spent years working on building sidewalks. Purchasing wood and food for poor families, putting water fountains in the schools, improving agricultural methods to maximize production, providing Sunday schools. All of these were local initiatives that aligned perfectly with Department of Indian Affairs policies and the Department's hope for Canada's First Nations. However, by the early 20th century, the Six Nations really had sort of taken the ball and were running with it in many ways. So the title of this paper, Our Strength Comes from the Land, it comes from words spoken to me by a Mohawk elder and an expert in the community on traditional gardening named OWHN Anderson. She founded the Horticultural Learning and Resource Center presently, where members are encouraged to grow their own food and to exchange seeds. And I've done some other research on some of this activity that's been going on more recently. She says, or she encourages people to grow more food themselves and to eat wild edibles, and to promote gardening and growing traditional foods with traditional methods. Our strength comes from the land, she says. Wild animals and plants all get their food from the land. In turn, we get our nourishment. She argues that I'm sure that's the only way we're going to survive, is to share what we know. That's the only way our that's the only way our culture can carry on, is to learn from the old folks or the elders or from each other for that matter, and not be ashamed of who you are. So I think when she said our strength comes from the land, she was sort of referring to a distant past, pre-colonialism, where Haudenosaunee women had a good degree of power in their community, deriving especially from the Three Sisters and control of crops. And in many ways, the impact of colonialism lessened that power. At least that was the goal.